We've already introduced the Bible's exilic literature. That is, the literature that arose out of Judah's time in exile. That is, they were captives in Babylon. This is described throughout the book of Jeremiah. It culminates in Babylon coming and destroying the city and taking some of the remaining people who were left in the city to Babylon as well. These were not the first people of Judah to be exiled. We read about the exile of the initial nobles and some of the highly educated people who were taken to Babylon, and this included Daniel. Now, the date for when this began to happen, that is with Daniel and some of his colleagues who are named in Daniel chapter 1, is somewhere around about 605 to 601 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came during the reign of Jehoiakim, as it says in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, just a note on this, there are some more liberal scholars who have a real problem with Bible prophecy. And this is going to become apparent because of the very, very particular Bible prophecies that are given in the book of Daniel. In fact, they are so remarkably accurate that many skeptics and liberal scholars of the Bible believed that the events must have been written after it actually happened as prophecy. In other words, it's actually not really prophecy, it's actually history dressed up as prophecy. But there's good reasons for believing that that's not the case. And Joyce Baldwin, in her IVP commentary on the book of Daniel, lists several of those reasons, including the fact that there's ancient languages apart from Hebrew that are used in the book of Daniel, which would have been prevalent around about the same time as what we are suggesting the text actually says. And also even Scriver, who was not necessarily sympathetic to the authenticity of dating the work of this to around about the late 500 BC, but he acknowledges that the language in here, the details in here, certainly suggests that it is authentic, that Daniel was one of the original captives taken over, and the work of his book is the result of the 70 years of his captivity in Babylon, as he describes. So with that in mind, Daniel is also an unusual book. It's unusual because of its place in the canon. Now, I say that because it's not that it doesn't belong there, it's that it's an unusual one to put into a genre, that is a type of book. We can say with, for example, the book of Joshua, that's a historical book. It details history. We can say of the book of Isaiah, that's a prophetic book. We can read through Psalms and we can go, well, that's poetry. And there's three genres of biblical literature. The exilic literature originated with a deep concern to call the people of Judah back into faithful covenant loyalty with Yahweh. That's the first point, the first purpose that there's any exilic literature in the Bible at all. It was calling those who are Jewish to come back into covenant loyalty with God, with Yahweh. Secondly, we see that it was designed to instruct future generations. This is obviously important because what was the focal point of Israel's worship and devotion to Yahweh was the temple, its priests, ceremonial practices, especially the sacrifices. So these things, when they were taken away into Babylon, the temple was destroyed, many of the priests were executed, and so now that brought to an end the entire central place of Israel's worship of God. So now what do? And the book of Daniel is a great example of what you now do. You can remain faithful to Yahweh without being in Judah. You can be a faithful covenant-keeping Jew without going to the temple. And thirdly, we see that the book, the exilic literature is presenting a future hope of the Messiah. And that is going to become incredibly apparent throughout the book of Daniel. Now, the mission to reach future generations, these generations that didn't know about the temple, they didn't see the animal sacrifices, they didn't experience what their fathers and grandfathers had grown up with. So what we have in this genre of literature, I'm calling it a genre, it's not really a genre, it's a period of where this various literature arose, is this exilic literature comprises of prophetic writing, poetic writing, and also wisdom literature. So as we will see, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and the Psalms originates out of this period. We'll also see that there's history that originates out of this period. For example, 1st and 2nd Chronicles originates out of this. And if you've ever read through the Old Testament and thought, hang on, I just read 1st and 2nd Kings, and now I'm reading Chronicles, why are they saying this again? Because it's a retelling. And there's a retelling with, let's come back to our original purpose of exilic literature, to bring people back to faithful covenant loyalty with God. So how do they do that? By presenting things in a positive light. And so we'll see that as we look at some of this literature. Now Daniel, this book, is it prophetic? Is it wisdom literature? Or is it history? And the answer is yes. And that's what also makes the book of Daniel unusual. Because Daniel, in the opening chapter, the criteria for him being selected was that he had to be a young man who exhibited wisdom, skillful in wisdom. Chapter 1, verse 4. And so we have this emphasis on seeking wisdom and being wise, and he will be described several times as having that, having the wisdom of the gods at one point, he's described. And so we have an emphasis on wisdom. We clearly have in the opening chapters, the first 6 chapters or so, is history. And then from chapter 7, which coincidentally at the end of chapter 7, beginning chapter 8, we have the writer returning to Hebrew language. Now, what I haven't mentioned is that the language of Babylon was Aramaic. And in chapter 2, after the first part of verse 4, the writing switches to Aramaic, the writing of Babylon. And this is another indication to point to its authenticity as well, that this is a very early Aramaic, and the Hebrew is still prevalent. And over the time of the exile, most of the Jews abandoned the Hebrew language and became entirely fluent in and conversant in Aramaic. Anyway, I'm digressing with a little bit of technicality here. So what we have is Daniel being presented in his book as someone who exhibited 4 strengths that were examples to the coming generation. Firstly, he's presented as a young man. We meet him when he's about 15 years of age. And we see that this 15-year-old young man, separated from his parents, taken from his home and his homeland, still, without the advantages of all that, maintained a very strong relationship with Yahweh, with God. Secondly, Daniel didn't view going to the temple as his act of worship. He viewed his life as an act of worship. And throughout the book, we will see that there are times when Daniel will get on his knees, facing Jerusalem, and pray. So he was doing what every Jew was called to do, as Solomon, when he dedicated the temple originally, if people looked to this temple, so they literally would look to the temple, no matter where they were in Israel. They would kneel facing the temple and pray. And that's what Daniel's doing. He didn't need the temple to be there. He didn't need the temple with animal sacrifices to worship. he continued to worship by living unto God in a very public way. That was the second point. Thirdly, Daniel had a Babylonian culture imposed upon him, and we see this in his name. Now, let me just point out here. Daniel in Hebrew means God is my judge. His name was changed to Belteshazzar, which means treasure of Bel. Bel was the god of Babylon. Hananiah means God has been gracious to me. His name was changed to Shadrach, which means inspiration of the sun, or Sol, the god Sol, which is where we get the word solar, solar power, solar energy, and so on. Sol, the sun, which was also a worship, object of worship in Babylonian religion. And Mishael, which means he who comes from God, or he who imitates God. And his name was changed to Mishach, which means he belongs to Shak Aku, which was a Babylonian god again. Azariah means the Lord is my helper. Sounds very similar to the word Ezzah, which is the Hebrew word for aid, assistant, the word used to describe the first woman who was to be Adam's aid, the helper. And sometimes there's some translations which don't correctly give us the full meaning of that by pointing out that she was some sort of maid to Adam. That's just not true. But anyway, Azariah, his name was changed to Abed-nego, which means servant of Nego. Now, Nego was Jupiter. In medieval literature, he was referred to as Jove. And so, you'll hear the expression, by Jove. Well, that's Jupiter. That's a part of medieval spirituality as well. But even back in the day of Babylon, this was a part of their worship series. Well, Daniel and his friends did not embrace that culture, that cultural imposition upon them. They were prepared to live in a culture that was antithetical. That is, it wasn't encouraging of their Judaism, their commitment to Yahweh at all. Now, we have in the book of Daniel a high, very high supernatural world. We have a king dreaming a dream, as we'll look at in just a moment. We have him not telling anyone the dream. In fact, threatening his wise men and his enchanters with death if they couldn't reveal by their incantations what his dream was. And who is able to interpret the dream after receiving the same dream? Daniel. And he's identified as Daniel. So he's holding on to his Jewish, his Hebrew heritage, being faithful to the covenant, to loyalty to God. We're going to jump in now and have a brief look at this episode where Daniel is presented with this dilemma. We're in chapter 2, and we see in verse 3, the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king, this is the magicians, the enchanters, astrologers, and so on. They said to the king in Aramaic. Now, that's a clue, because right there, this is the point in the text where the original language changes to Aramaic. So this is what they're saying in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king, verse 5, answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So let me go ahead in this story. It's a beautiful story, and this is the whole point of Daniel's book. It is one adventure after another. Then we come into the prophetic section, and it's an uncanny telling of the future. So this is an incredibly exciting book. If it's not your favorite book, it soon will be once you begin to see the depths of this. So Daniel, he tells his friends, he's in community. We saw this in our previous session. Pray for me. And then Daniel does something really unusual. He goes to sleep. So we read in verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. doesn't use their Babylonian names, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon, because the wise men of Babylon had not any clue what this dream was, and the order was from Nebuchadnezzar, okay, kill them all now. And so Daniel has gone to the king and said, give me a moment, my God will reveal it to me, and he does. Verse 19. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven, and Daniel answered and said, and he just breaks into worship. It's absolutely extraordinary. We go over to verse 36, and he tells the king the very dream that the king had dreamt, and the king had told no one what the dream was. And so we read this. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power and the might and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, or the birds of heavens, making you rule over them all, you are the head of gold. So Nebuchadnezzar has seen a statue. And so we read in the previous section, verse 31, you saw, O king, behold a great image, and it has a head of gold, it has a chest of silver, and it has a midriff of bronze, it has legs of iron, and then feet that are made of iron and clay. So Daniel's now going to interpret what all this means. And so we read here that verse 39, you are the head of gold, into verse 38, another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, and shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks into pieces and shatters all things, and like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw, the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of the iron shall be in it. All right, so this is what Nebuchadnezzar saw, and Daniel tells him these are kingdoms to come. And what we see is that Babylon is the head of gold. We see that Persia, or the Medo-Persian Empire, was the chest of silver. We see that the midriff of bronze was the Greek Empire. After the Greek Empire, it comes the Roman Empire, represented by iron. And then we see that there is a coalition of iron and clay. It doesn't really mix. It's not meant to go together, but they come up against a small, it says, a small stone or a small rock. They go to stomp the small rock, and the rock, instead of being crushed, crushes them, and they disintegrate. And Daniel has just given one of the most profound Christological prophecies anywhere in the Bible. Christological means it's about Christ. It's about him. So we read down in verse 45, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. And Nebuchadnezzar's response is to acknowledge that the God of Daniel was the true God. And this reveals another point that comes out about the telling of this account in Daniel. That Daniel is used by God to bring people to the knowledge of the true God. And this was the purpose of Israel. Daniel is now the epitome of what Israel was meant to be, a light to the nations, a light to the Gentiles. What we're going to see in our next section, that there's even more adventures that happen here. There's his colleagues being thrown into a furnace, and they don't get burned, they don't even get their hair singed, they don't even come out with the smell of smoke. This is an extraordinary story. I encourage you to read it in chapter 3. And then we're going to come into the prophetic section, and we're going to see, just after Daniel was thrown to the lions, he receives again more visions, more prophetic understanding of what was to come. And ultimately, what's coming is Christ. So this is Daniel. This is a part of why I consider Daniel to be one of my heroes. He was someone who was faced with all kinds of opposition, but he remained faithful to God, and he and his book stands as a testament to what it's like to be faithful to God in the midst of a society and a culture that is opposed to God. So, would you join with me in our next installment as we look at the Bible's exilic literature and what it has to teach us today? Hope to see you then.